Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this membership brown bag where the Connecticut Digital Archive and members of their leadership team will be sharing their work, Escaping Our Fishbowl, a case study on expanding participation. Brown bags, as you all know, are meeting style instead of webinars, so we invite you to join the conversation, to ask questions, whether you decide to get on the mic or use the chat box. And these are intended as a way to connect with network colleagues on topics of interest that are of mutual interest and benefit. I'll turn it over now to Greg Colati to start our program this afternoon. Thank you all.
I will unmute. Thank you, Shanae. We're really happy to be here today. This project that we're doing is something that we feel very strongly about. We call it Escaping the Fishbowl, and it's a case study on expanding participation in the CTDA, which is the DPLA Service Hub for Connecticut. Our plan today is to speak for about 20-25 minutes and then open the floor to discussion. We really want to have a discussion. We think we're going to be bringing up some interesting ideas that deserve consideration and discussion. You are welcome to post questions in the chat as we go along. We'll address them and others during the question period. If you really want to say something, like raise your hand, and we are always happy to address things in line if the occasion is suitable for it. You can find out more about our project from the URL that you see up on the screen. And that URL will come back again at the end of the, on the last slide of the presentation. Our speakers today come from multiple organizations. Until last month, Mike Kemezis and I ran the CTDA from the University of Connecticut. And now Mike is the manager of programs and projects at CT Humanities. And it's been great working with Mike. I'm glad I get to keep working with Mike in CT Humanities. Rachael, Nutt, and Heather Owen are graduate students in the Syracuse High School and were interns on the CTDA in Context program during the summer of 2021. Unfortunately, Heather is unable to join us today, and so Rachael will be presenting on her behalf. With that, let's get into the details of the CTDA, our investigations, and our findings. And I'll turn it over to Mike.
Great. Can everyone hear me? I just wanted to unmute myself. Thank you. Yes, as Greg said, my name is Mike Kemezis, and I'm currently the manager for partnerships and programs at the Connecticut Humanities Council. And like Greg said, I was the repository manager for the Connecticut Digital Archive until last month. But during my time, I was in my position when we developed the idea for CTDA in Context, starting in the summer of 2020, and when we wrote our white paper this past summer of 2021. So I'm very happy to be back here talking about this project and to talk to all of you and answer all of your questions. So before we kind of get into it, let's go over who we are, a quick overview of the CTDA. The Connecticut Digital Archive is a program of the Digital Preservation Repository Unit at the University of Connecticut Library based in Storrs. Until last month, the unit was composed of 2 full-time staff members. Currently, the unit has 1 full-time staff member, Greg, as he said, and is currently in the process of hiring part-time staff to keep the lights on until a new repository manager is hired. The unit works with several graduate interns across many projects at any given time, and several undergraduate student employees as well. The CTDA was launched in November 2013 with a handful of collections and about 28,000 digital objects, all from one single organization, the University of Connecticut Archives and Special Collections. Today, and I checked this before this meeting, today the unit is responsible for stewarding the preservation of 2.9+ million digital objects, totaling over 70 terabytes of data. The repository continues to grow, averaging between 25 to 30,000 objects added per month, equaling close to 1 terabyte of data. The CTDA currently has over 85 institutional members, with 1 or 2 new institutions or organizations joining the repository per month since the beginning of 2021. We have close to 200 content managers from across our membership that use the repository to add and/or update all of their content. So what we do, the CTDA's mission as the statewide digital preservation repository is to provide the technical infrastructure to manage, maintain, and disseminate digital collections for member institutions. The CTDA does not own or curate any of the content in the repository. Our members have total responsibility for determining what they add and how they manage their content. We support our members by providing resources, training, and collaborative opportunities across the membership and the wider state. We also advise potential participants about what the CTDA can offer to their organization and refer them to alternative programs that exist around the state suitable for their specific needs. So there's a lot going on in Connecticut for such a small state. We are members of several cultural heritage coalitions regionally, nationally, and internationally. We work with the State Library, the State Historical League, and the State Humanities Council on several big ticket projects to enhance statewide digital collections, digital cultural systems, and infrastructure. And as was mentioned, we serve as the Connecticut Hub for the Digital Public Library of America. We sit on the Islandora Foundation Coordinating Committee, which is the software that powers the CTDA, and we actively participate in the Open GLAM movement. Next slide, Greg. There we go. So CTDA in context. CTDA in context is a program designed to break down traditional power structures and inspire change, both at the institutional and systematic levels in the cultural heritage landscape in Connecticut. We feel we have the responsibility to examine and improve the frameworks that we create and to provide benefits to our membership in the larger cultural heritage community in Connecticut and regionally around New England. The idea for CTDA in the CTDA in Context program started with conversations between myself and Kayla Hinkson Grant, our intern in the summer of 2020. Kayla had questions about the silences in the repository, specifically the lack of representation of the Indigenous communities in the state among the millions of objects from more than 70 member institutions that we had at the time. Through many conversations, we decided to work to place the CTDA in the proper context of the digital cultural heritage landscape. And initially, we wanted to figure out how to diversify our collections and our membership. We held internal discussions for about 8 months before we assembled a working group from our community and presented them with our ideas. After more discussions and feedback from this group, we decided we needed to do additional research concerning the landscape of digital cultural heritage in Connecticut specifically and the United States more generally. Originally, when we first started talking about this project, we wanted to focus on diversifying our collections and memberships from the get-go. We discovered that we needed to better understanding of our program to make lasting systemic changes that will allow us to incorporate the values of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility into the core of what we do as a thriving program. Our research, with the help of Rachael Nutt and Heather Owen during the summer of 2021, produced the CTDA in Context white paper we're presenting here today. So I'm going to throw it back to Greg, who will give you more background about our research goals and the method we used for this paper.
Thanks, Mike. This often quoted David Foster Wallace commencement speech is something that kind of resonated with us as we began to think about what it is and what it meant to be multicultural. It reminds us that some of the most obvious and important realities are the ones that are the hardest to see and talk about because they fade into the background of our lives and don't even get thought about. When we began thinking about making the CTDA more multicultural, we really decided that we needed to find out on what were our core assumptions based, right? The ones we didn't think about. And what was the water in which we were swimming? And how did these assumptions influence the things we did and with whom we did them? We also wanted to know if we shared these assumptions with other organizations like us, most specifically other DPLA hubs. We had a hypothesis that the CTDA and also the DPLA hubs were essentially monocultural in their infrastructures and how they communicated, but not necessarily in their content. Even when, like us, they made a commitment to attracting and working with underrepresented and community groups. We thought our worldviews, and especially the way we constructed our knowledge systems, was dominated by white Western thinking. So we embarked on a journey of self-reflection by looking at ourselves, our members, and our colleagues in the DPLA Hub network. Today, we are presenting these discoveries, not using a strict methodology of social science, but in a way that we think is more anecdotal and personal, and hopefully more accessible. Here's where Heather was going to present some part of the findings, but Rachel is going to present those for us and then go on and present the findings from her part of the research. Rachel.
Thank you, Greg. So I'm not Heather, but I'll do my best to do her research justice. So our first step of understanding ourselves was to look at where we fit in with the DPLA Hub landscape. So we first looked at Hub websites. However, we ran into a lot of difficulties at this stage because most of the websites, including our own, we found difficult to navigate. They contained a lot of jargon that was very technical, and they lacked some information we were looking for, or even sometimes provided contradictory information. So while this made it difficult for us to accumulate all the data we wanted to gather for our research, it also raised an important question, which was, are websites themselves a barrier of entry? Next slide, please. Since we couldn't find all of the information that we were looking for on the websites, we decided to bolster this research by sending out a survey to the DPLA hubs to answer our questions. So out of the 27 hubs we reached out to, 14 responded to the survey. And we're trying to keep this at 20 minutes, so I don't want to we're not going to go through everything in depth. But if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or to Heather with any questions or comments, anything like that. Next slide, please. So first, we determined that hubs vary greatly in size and that most hubs have no participation fee. And that's very important to keep in mind as we compare them in the following, or in the next slides. Next slide, please. We also determined that hubs mostly work with institutions such as libraries, archives, and museums, and most institutions become participants in hubs via an application process. Although many hubs seem very willing to work with different sorts of institutions, it is not something that happens frequently. So one thing we came up with was thinking that hubs could examine themselves to determine why this may be. Next slide, please. Interestingly, we determined that the requirements to become a hub are not universal between hubs, and no single requirement to become a hub is shared by all hubs. So this raises an interesting question, which is what requirements are truly necessary in order to join a DPLA hub? And could we lower requirements in order to encourage more groups to participate? Next slide, please. We also determined that no service is offered by all of the hubs, no single service is offered by all of the hubs, which raises an interesting question on what services would be most imperative to assisting newcomers. Next slide, please. So in conclusion to the Heather segment of the research, we determined that hubs, websites can be an issue with hubs in terms of clear language and a lot of jargon to explain how hubs work. We also determined that hubs may want to open themselves up to institutions that are not customary and expected, and hubs should also reconsider the requirements they have for participation. Next slide, please. So my portion of the research, instead of focusing on the landscape of hubs in general, I looked at the CTDA itself. So just as you need to understand who your identity as a researcher. For example, we are all on this team, we are white people who are connected to academic institutions. It's also important to look at our members to find out what parts make up the whole that is CTDA. So we decided to do this by examining the mission and vision statements that our members have made publicly available on their websites. So not all statements were publicly available, and a statement is just one facet of an institution's identity. But these mission and vision statements are a good place for us to start because they're concise summaries of who an institution is, what their values are, and what their goals are. Next slide, please. So of the 76 members that were in the repository upon this data collection, 52 of them had publicly available mission or vision statements. We ran those statements through Voyant tools, which is a text visualization device, to create visualizations of this text to help better understand trends in the data. One example of these visualizations is this word cloud, which shows what the most frequently occurring terms are. I've listed these terms to the right. So there were some prizes in here. We didn't expect history to be one of the top terms, for example, and public didn't rank as highly as we thought it would. However, these terms made a little more sense when you consider our member makeup. Next slide, please. As you can see in this pie chart, our top 3 institutions in order are public libraries, museums, and historical societies. This would explain why terms like history are so prevalent, and it also explains why community was our top term. Understanding our member makeup in this way also helps us to understand other trends in our data. Next slide, please. In addition to visualizations, I also took a look at how the language of our member mission and vision statements aligned with certain frameworks. One of these frameworks was the Strategic Diversity Manifesto, and another one we looked at was the Multicultural Organization Development Model, or MCOD model. These helped us to understand how the language used supported or didn't support concepts of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access within institutions. For example, although most members use language that does support accessibility, very few use the term equitable access outright. Again, these statements are just one piece of our members' identities, but because they are definitions of who they are, it's important information to consider. Next slide, please. Moving forward with our analysis of our participating institutions, we'd like to include more text than just mission and vision statements. So value statements, goal statements, and diversity statements, for example, would be really helpful inclusions in this data set. We've also created a map of where our members' headquarters are, and we're looking to pair this information with census data to start understanding more about the populations that our members serve or are at least close to. And that concludes my portion of the research. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and by extension, Heather. You can see that the CTDA, as you know, is a small organization, and we did our best to ask and answer some questions for ourselves and about our membership and our colleagues with the time and resources that we had available. So we didn't do extensive methodological research, but we just asked some questions that we wanted to get some answers to. It led to a lot more questions that we hope we can find the time and energy to answer. We think our experience is valid for us and can be a guide for other repositories. From our research, we've identified 4 areas of investigation and work that we have ahead of us. I don't think these 4 areas will surprise anyone, nor will I think our proposed solutions will either, once you begin to think about them. The solutions are kind of common sense, at least to our eyes. Of course, that's where we get into the whole idea of the water in which we swim and the world that we don't think about that has so much to do with how we perceive the world. But most importantly, I think the message we want to convey is that thoughtful, self-examination can uncover systemic biases even in the most forward-thinking organizations. So let's look at some of these things. Outreach, as Heather's research showed us, how we describe ourselves to others currently speaks only to those who already know what we are and how and what we do and how we do it. We are working to make our mission and message more understandable to the general public and to those not currently part of our group. Our website needs to be clearer in language and organization and needs to use non-technical language that speaks to a wider population. We're reviewing now our public-facing introductory pages, our resource center, user documentation, and even our social media presence to improve our connection to our audiences. A second aspect is our technology platform. And I think there's a growing realization that technology is not neutral and that many of our technology practices are inherently biased. I think our technology platform and how we use it needs a deeper analysis and improvements, especially in terms of, say, metadata vocabularies we suggest and connect our users to. Since the CTDA is not merely an aggregator, but is a content management system for our community, right? We can connect them with vocabularies, terminology that crosses multiple disciplines and multiple cultures, but we don't right now. Okay, this is something we never even thought about. And now we're thinking about it. Now we're thinking about how we connect our people to different cultural ways of organizing their world. Along with that, while our system works best with hierarchically organized collections, we're working to flatten the organizational requirements and use relationship mapping to make connections more fluid and discovery more organic. Our primary result display, which is a list ordered by relevance, will need to include some alternative display options to meet the needs of more diverse audiences and different intellectual and learning approaches. So there's a lot to do here in how our technology helps us manage and present and shapes how we manage and present our collections. The third aspect is inclusion. The CTDA operates basically in the customary digital cultural world in Connecticut. It's based in a large public academic institution. We kind of see these as two strikes against us when we seek to connect with community or underrepresented groups. This aspect of inclusion is very difficult for us. And when where we have the least knowledge and experience, we're really looking for examples and suggestions from you all. And you'll see some ideas in the slide. Another thing that we are coming to understand is that since the CTDA does not own content, since the CTDA does not have coercive power over the membership, there are things that we can't do to develop more inclusive participation, but we can do things at the CTDA level. So we don't have much control over the collections, but we do have control over the system. And that's very important. Finally, and what I think is the most radical idea that has come from our research is this idea to create participation requirements based not on institutional characteristics, but on a commitment to stewardship. The CTDA has always had an open policy regarding content selection and metadata, leaving those decisions to content owners. We wonder what would happen if we extended this open policy to participation and let anyone who was willing to commit to certain requirements of stewardship have a place in the preservation archive that is the CTDA. Now, understanding that opening the archive in this way does not stop traditional organizations from continuing to collect, arrange, and describe content. This topic of citizen and community participation in content creation is not new to archives, but these efforts are typically undertaken with the oversight of information professionals affiliated with a customary repository. Again, we wonder what would happen if we let community groups or even individuals curate their own history in a permanent digital archive? Or do these groups and people in fact require mediation from professionals to create so-called permanently valuable collections? How far can we democratize access to creating primary sources? And how much knowledge about archival practice do you need to curate your own story? What questions of reliability and authenticity are raised by connecting content creators directly with digital archives? And how does this change the role of traditional gatekeepers? This brings into question the role of the so-called information professional in historical documentation and can seem very threatening to the customary keepers of cultural heritage, who prize their knowledge, training, and understanding of best practices as the key to turning a massive amorphous stuff into useful information. Yet, these customary practices may in fact be reinforcing the hegemony of customary institutions over the cultural heritage landscape, and may be reinforcing a monolithic cultural outlook. Being forced to pass a cultural or organizational test to participate in preservation is by its very nature exclusionary. How much exclusion is necessary or warranted? These are not new questions, but current technology allows us to imagine answering them in new ways. What would be the effect on the historical record if we allowed this to happen? right? And how does this change the definitions of authenticity in digital repositories? What role would archivists play in this new scenario? Right now, we're at the beginning stages of partnering with the Connecticut Historical Society's efforts to create a community archives by offering a service that we're calling CTDA Me, allowing individuals the opportunity to become members of the CTDA. Technology has been changing how we collect, preserve, and disseminate primary sources for millennia. The system we use today is just one iteration of record-keeping systems that have been changing since the beginnings of culture. We suggest that it's time to think about creating a new relationship between digital preservation and content creation. And this will in turn help open the preservation of archival material to all groups and all people with stories to tell. So these are some of the questions that we raised and considered. We want to know if any of these questions resonate with you. And so now we'll begin to answer questions from the chat, which I don't see any. And we urge you to ask questions, offer comments and suggestions about any part of this presentation. You see the link to the CTDA in context in our white paper from which this presentation is derived, and we urge you to contact us in the future as well. So that concludes the formal part of the presentation, but we really do want to know what you think of our research, our conclusions, our 4 points of emphasis. Because when we have been talking about this to people, some people have been surprised, some people have been supportive, some people have been outraged, some people have been challenged to look at themselves differently. What is it from you that resonated from what we've said? And so Alicia says it was incredibly informative. What did you learn that you didn't know already, or that you hadn't thought of already?
There's a hand up, Greg. Kelly?
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that. Oh, thank you, Mike. Oh, yes. Kelly, yes. Yeah,
Hi.
feel free to jump in.
Sure, thank you. So I love this. I love the thought processes going on here. The idea of, collaborating with your community members in curating their own histories. And it did bring to mind one scenario that I just thought I'd share with you, because you asked, can our community, curate their own collection? How would that look? Or do they need the help of, specialists, as digital librarians and whatever? And so we do have a little experience with this at our institution. And we did have
Could you identify where you're from?
Yeah,
yes.
I'm so sorry. Yes.
That's
so
good.
I'm a digital archives librarian at Florida International University. And we were working with a community member, and they did basically get to just take their content and upload it into a repository, which then can be shared, out to DPLA. But they were not librarians, or they were not archivists, right? So what happened is they would put 200 items under one record name and then one record identifier. And of course, it was only searchable to the record level. So then you had no idea what those other 200 items were in that file unless you had time to go through it. And so we realized that, yes, the community actually may need our assistance. So while we want them to maybe put it together, I think they do need our assistance. I mean, you can, of course, come across somebody who is truly an archivist at heart, and they curate an amazing collection, and they understand how the repository works and at what level it's searchable. But that was kind of it's taken us countless hours and intern help and to unravel it. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. No, that is actually something we hear a lot. Does anyone out there have a sort of response or support of that before I turn it over to sort of our group? But that is the kind of thing that we hear a lot.
I can fill kind of the response time here in that, you know, to be a little flippant, there are people that work at our institutions that do the same exact thing that you just mentioned and work in the system and still don't understand it. So that kind of brings up my idea of kind of like, is this kind of an information thing or is this a technology thing? Is there a way where you can tailor the technology to make it useful to people who might not understand or might not be professional archivists or information professionals? There are some tools out there that I've seen that, you know, would allow for kind of guided ways through the technology so that those issues wouldn't happen. But again, people break things in the weirdest ways. Even people we work with do the strangest things using the technology. So yeah, that's kind of a resource thing, is how straightforward can you make it? And that's kind of, you know, I always tell people working with the repository, we work with Islandora. Working with the repository is not like uploading a photo to Facebook or Twitter. It's just not. And part of me is, as I worked at the CTDA, is like, well, why not? And we all understand why not, but kind of the theoretical, like, well, why not? Why can't we make it more straightforward to make it more accessible to people? So that's really good to know. That kind of like, yeah, that definitely would happen, and we would probably run into that. But I would counter in saying we work with people who are information professionals that still do that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a reflection on, I think, us and our training and what we make available, and kind of working with the technology.
But here's where, and Anne will get to you in 1 second. I just want to say something. Here is where our unconscious bias fits in. What's wrong with making one record and attaching 200 things to it? Like, what's wrong with that? It's harder to find for you, but maybe for this person or this person's group, it's not. And so I think that's where, you know, it's really easy to say, oh, well, they need this support to learn how to do it right. But maybe it's just how we're looking at this. And I'm not saying, I'm not choosing anything. I'm just saying, like, let's try to think of it not from our perspective. Anne had her hand up, so.
Yeah,
Yes,
thanks.
Anne, where are you from?
I'm at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
Great.
So yeah, thanks. One of the things that strikes me about this conversation is how much what you're proposing in this particular, you know, effort that Kelly and Mike were just talking about is about enabling the community, and how much of it really is about pushing labor off onto the community. And I know that's not a nice way to put it, but you know, I think it's something to be careful of in the work that we've done. You know, with community members, they're really eager to have us help them. And what I'm interested in, I think, is how much of the, and I came in just a few minutes late, so I apologize. How much of the kind of research that you're doing is focused on your own, how you're presenting yourselves, and how much of it is focused on what the community would, you know, like, you know, are there ways that we can reach out and invest the community in creating and curating their own records by help asking them to help us with things like controlled vocabularies, but not necessarily with structuring a collection, for example. So just a little bit of nuance, I suppose, to how some of that might happen.
Do any of do Rachael or Mike want to address that? Or
I have some ideas, but why don't you start, Greg, because mine's kind
sure.
of tangential to all of this.
Yes, I think we will find and have found that if people want to participate, they generally want support. And so that's good. But, you know, it's, I forget what I was going to say. So generally, if you're interested enough to want to participate, you're interested enough to want to learn something about how things are done. And so that will probably lead to things being somewhat normalized. But if someone really wants to organize something a different way, I don't think we should tell them, no, you can't.
I'm kind of thinking more of like the labor question that came up.
Oh, right, right. I'm sorry, I forgot the labor question.
There's a trade-off, I think, and that kind of, we don't have answers for this. We don't describe, we don't add, we don't curate anything. We come in to do support if someone has questions or wants to augment their metadata, or is kind of like, hey, can you look at this for me? Or I'm not sure what to do or how to describe this. We'll support that, but we don't actually do that work. The trade-off is that we don't then dictate, like kind of how, get back to Greg's point, we don't dictate how people work with their collections in the repository. People contain full autonomy and full agency for how their collections are added, how they're described, how they arrange them, of course, within the bounds of the technology. So there's kind of the trade-off. We only ask for a couple things to actually add something to the repository. Do you own this? And we kind of take it at good faith that yes, you have the right to put this on the internet. You have the right to preserve this. And it's not a virus, right? So besides that, we have very, very a low barrier entry for metadata, where you're kind of the lowest you can get, because we feel that, and this has been a part of the program since the very beginning. So this is one of our foundations, is that we don't dictate what you put in and how you put it in, as long as you own it and it's not a virus. So yeah, that kind of does push the labor off a bit to the institution to make those kind of actually do the work. But at the same time, we're a support system for them. We are also kind of not, we don't have the labor available to us to do that work for them either. Unlike some other kind of places and other hubs that are around, right? That might do digitization, that might do metadata. We focus more on the system and being a connector to these bigger conversations and making sure the system works while educating and providing support and resources to these institutions. It kind of brings up a good question. Will that model have to change when we work with different institutions? Again, we're working with people that are somewhat familiar with a lot of this stuff going into it.
Okay, but when we talk about the question of labor, right, it's also a question of knowledge. Like, who is better equipped to describe, and this is a question I don't know, who is better equipped to describe and explain their content than the people who created it or live with it, or it's part of their culture. We see a lot of projects like Zooniverse or these other sort of community-based archives. I mean, I know say at UConn, where we're based, the special collections folks are wonderful, but they don't know everything about 19th century steam locomotives. Yet we have a large collection of 19th century steam locomotive records, and we regularly have railroad experts come in to identify content and talk about content. And so, you know, the sort of citizen archivist idea is a way of not offloading labor, but perhaps being more inclusive and letting people who understand the content be the ones who describe it. Plus, in this idea of CTDA Me, you have to make a commitment that you're going to manage your content and make a commitment to it. So it's not necessarily for everyone. Grace agreed that labor could be an issue. Of course, labor is always an issue. I don't think the labor issue is ever going to go away. But yes, it is an issue. Yeah.
And we've had discussions about that. Right, we've had discussions about all of these things that didn't make it into the paper, about labor, about kind of bringing people in to describe content. Can someone who's not part of the community describe it? And we've had all these conversations. We have a conversation about how we talk about these kinds of things, how we address the institutions we work with, how we address the institutions we don't work with. And we're still kind of learning. We have like reams and reams of messages on our Slack channel about all of this stuff that didn't really surface because we didn't have space in the white paper. But, you know, that has come up through almost a year of internal conversations that we've had about this. And we're still learning, I think.
Well, and you know, to turn this sort of upside down, there is an attitude that we see that an archivist or someone who manages primary source content, unless they are of that culture that they're working, that the papers are working with, they cannot properly manage a collection from that culture. And I don't agree with that, but there are some people who think that. Because managing a collection is not the same way, is not the same thing. I don't know if any of you think that one way or the other. You know, does a collection, I mean, obviously, we don't expect a person to be a 18th century Enlightenment writer to to manage a collection of writing from the 18th century Enlightenment. And so how does that relate to contemporary collections management and description and access? Let's see, we have a question from Adrian. Thank you for initiating the research and sharing your findings and action plan. Are there also additional areas of research that you are embarking on to suggest that we undertake to assess CTDA and or the broader hub's landscape? I think Rachel mentioned that we need to know more about the not just the mission statements, right, Rachel? What else do we want to know about members of these hubs in order to understand them better?
And I think one of the things that we've talked about is researching how to reach these groups that we don't reach with what we're currently doing. How do we go about building those relationships, even identifying these groups, talking about what we do, kind of building trust that we are not kind of this institution that's going to come in, digitize your collection, put it up, and then leave, right? Like take over. So, you know, I think part of it was also looking at that. That's kind of one of the aspects. How to reach out, how to build those relationships. And I think we're all kind of asking those questions. Even at my current institution, we're asking those questions. How to appropriately approach these institutions, or, you know, we don't want to help them, but let them know we are here to work with them and not come in and say, we'll help you because you don't know what you're doing. We're here to work with you if you're interested, and let them know this is a resource. We're a resource. I think that's another thing we talked a lot about. We're not here, we're not going in to help people. That's not our goal. And you know, to say it in that way, we're a resource for people who want to work with us. And how do we build that and let them know that we are trustworthy people to work with?
I think in addition to being able to work on what Mike said, there's also how for people who have collections that want to, you know, share them with other people, like how do we make that accessible for other people to look at? So like the question of educational resources that we could create, or guidelines or things like that could for people with collections that want to put these out into the world a little bit more, like if we are able to support that sort of thing as well.
Right. Thank you, Rachel. I think also to address Adrian's question, the variety of types of organizations that hubs are make it difficult to suggest something we all should do other than be better about explaining ourselves. Some institutions are, some hubs are aggregators only. And so that makes it harder for them to have an impact on how, I think it does actually, on how members use or deal with the content that they aggregate to the DPLA. Other institutions do have management tools, and they have a little more ability. Some institutions get to pick and choose who they join and who they work with. So that also is another way. But I think being better at how we explain ourselves, I think that was the thing that really surprised me the most. I thought we were really good at explaining ourselves. And then Rachael and Heather, Rachael and Heather says, like, nobody who doesn't know how this works could ever possibly penetrate this. And that was just like, wow, you're absolutely right. We live in our happy little bubble, and we want to expand the bubble. So if it's something that everybody can do, it's really understand, it's like, wow, where do I come from and who do I reach? And is that a connection that we're making? Other questions or comments? And remember, we would love to hear from you. And if you want to read the whole white paper, there it is, bit.ly/3RM52EC, capital C. And we'd love to hear from you. We really would. We don't want to swim in our own fishbowl forever. we want to share the water with everyone. Drop the URL in the chat. You bet I can. Possibly. There it goes. Yeah, it's interesting. So that that white paper was produced in November. I think there's already things we would say differently now that we've taken this show on the road. Like I said, to CNI in December, and now you all here in February, and talking amongst our own local groups. And so it's evolving, which is kind of really interesting. But the website will continue to evolve. So that, oh yeah, and there's the project website. Actually, I think it's just HTTP, isn't it, Mike? I don't think it's an S, but it could be. Sinead, should I turn it back to you to say thank you and advertise the next one? Oh, do we plan to continue the survey on a regular basis? I don't know, Rachel, what do you think?
I suppose we could. I'd have to talk with Heather about that because we've been meaning to expand our research on this topic anyway. And that could definitely be a way that we would do that. So stay tuned. Oh.
Pushing them. They're graduate students. But actually, it's really interesting if we took a baseline of 2021 or 2022 and started pushing this idea to the hubs and through the DPLA, and then in 2027, like 5 years from now, looked at the websites again and to see if we've made any headway or something like that. That would be actually really interesting. Oh, all right, we'll write that down as something to think about. That's a great idea. I'm muted. Anyone else have a comment? Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for your comments and interest. We are just in our own little corner of the world trying to find the best way to connect people with content and to preserve that content over the long term. So we don't pretend to have all the answers, but we really appreciate the discussion.
Thank you all for such a great discussion and for being transparent about the work you've had to do to be self-aware, to consider how the language we use is being translated to others, because it's great when we can communicate well, but if the words that we're using aren't landing and people don't understand us, then it's gibberish. And the conversation around the conversation thread around metadata and the labor around that is very interesting as we look at, you know, some of the materials in DPLA and some community collections that are named with the same title over and over again. We think about access and discovery, but like Mike said, the work is back on the institution to, you know, provide the most information that they can, and we have to support them to do that, educate and support them and let them know, you know, what we need and the so what piece, because they've collected these collections, but we ultimately want them to be accessible, and providing the best description is important work for us. So thank you all for such a rich discussion. And we do not have another brown bag scheduled, but if this conversation has sparked more ideas and there's work in your hub that you'd like to share as a companion to this or another topic that was raised, please get in touch and we'll work on scheduling that. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.